Peter Credlin, live on Sky News Australia.
Good evening, great to have your company. Here's what's coming up tonight on Credlin. The truth of the COVID overreach finally coming out. Although I don't think you had any doubts about it, I certainly didn't. It was all about politics, not health, driving those premiers. At the same time too, AstraZeneca's pulling that vaccine. I'll discuss what needs to happen now so that we don't repeat the same mistakes in the future. With former PM Tony Abbott, we'll also cover the warnings he got on a recent trip overseas about energy and our immigration issues. A rare moment of common sense from a Labor minister when it comes to gas. However, the pragmatic Madeleine King has an uphill battle, not just with the Greens and the Teals, but also inside Labor as she pushes them to develop more gas rather than ban it. That shocking 75% funding cut to one of Australia's premier cancer research centres, just at the very time that our country's cancer rates are surging. And that military incident with China got a whole lot worse today, with Beijing now claiming our naval helicopter was on a spy mission. Yet still no move from the Prime Minister to defend our military personnel, too focused on kowtowing to pick up the phone.
The Prime Minister should be on the phone today to the Chinese President to say this is completely and utterly unacceptable and we won't tolerate it. You can't treat our soldiers and sailors and airmen and women like this.
But first, reading the headlines today, it would be easy to think that the Albanese government had suddenly seen the light on gas. The Australian ran new gas supply central to net zero. Labor to back more gas, said the Australian Financial Review. And today, Resources Minister Madeleine King released the federal government's future gas strategy. That, she said, was based on facts and data, not ideology or wishful thinking. In a powerful op-ed, the Labor minister said, a future made in Australia will need Australian gas. We will need affordable energy, she says, or gas to support energy reliability for households and businesses as we move to a more renewable grid. We need gas to support Australian manufacturing and tens of thousands of jobs. Our region, said the minister, needs gas to warm our homes and cook our meals and to power the great cities of Asia. Turning off gas overnight, warned Minister King, would do untold damage to our economy, impede efforts to get to net zero and have a severe impact on our region. The minister pointed out that Australia currently supplies about 20% of the world's gas, earning us more than $70 billion in export income this year. Gas, she said, powers 5 million Australian homes, supports more than 80,000 jobs too. And Minister Madeleine King, it should be said, is dead right on all counts. But is she speaking for the government or just herself? Because in the Australian's report, this is her op-ed, there's this telling remark, quote, Ms King said she hoped this view was shared by all the Cabinet. Shared by all the Cabinet. That's her hope. I doubt it would be entirely shared by Cabinet colleague, the climate evangelist and anti-fossil fuel campaigner Chris Bowen, despite his tepid recent endorsement of gas. The Prime Minister too, he was pretty tepid today.
We support net zero. Gas and its firming capacity is a part of assisting with that pathway.
And that pro-gas position of King, well, that's certainly not shared by Victorian Labor, which tends to call the tune for Labor everywhere else. Victorian Labor has banned new gas connections to homes, claimed there's no point in new gas exploration given they want to ban gas. They ban fracking, even though it's routinely used to maximise gas extraction in Labor-run Queensland.
Gas costs much more than electricity. The cheapest and most reliable form of new energy is renewable electricity. And that's why we've made some announcements in relation to new planning permits and gas.
What a lie there. Late last year, the Resources Minister, Lily D'Ambrosio, tweeted, getting off gas is better for your bills, better for your health and better for the climate. And it's not just Labor's dominant Green Left faction that's allergic to all fossil fuels, including gas, even though gas has got about half the emissions of coal and is essential to firm intermittent wind and solar. woke public companies are also anti-fossil fuel now too. Anti-gas, in fact. The ABC Bank today announcing it would no longer lend to new coal or gas projects except in a national emergency. The ANZ has reportedly told its investors it would move to block further funding for extraction projects, even though it acknowledged, and I quote, gas plays a material and important part in meeting Australia's current energy needs and will do so for the foreseeable future. So the federal Labor government, or at least one minister in it, thinks that gas is essential. The Victorian Labor government thinks that gas is deplorable. And our biggest corporates and institutional lenders, well, they think gas is essential, but still won't lend money to develop it. Any wonder our country is in a mess. Finally today too, some truth about Australia's COVID response. The former Federal Health Minister, Greg Hunt, made a personal submission to the federal government's COVID inquiry. And in it, he slammed the state governments for making decisions that were not subject to health advice. Now, we all know that here in Victoria in particular, the Andrews government was not following the medical science. They were following political science. As Greg Hunt makes clear, there was no health advice to have a curfew, no health advice to limit people to within 5 kilometres of their home, and certainly no health advice not to use police and the military to run hotel quarantine. Here's what he just said to Chris Kenny in the last hour.
I highlighted in the submission that I was not aware of medical advice for curfews in Victoria or for the 5 kilometre rule, and I believe there was some discussion at the time that there was not a medical basis. And
it was not.
If you had to have medical advice, then those elements would arguably never have occurred, and I think that would have been a good outcome.
Rightly, the former minister acknowledged that our presumptions of individual freedom came under real threat during the pandemic. Now, as you know, I think this current federal inquiry is ludicrously short of the full Royal Commission needed into every aspect of the handling of the pandemic. The border closures, the loss of freedoms, educational setbacks, particularly for kids, the mental health impacts, the suicides, all that happened as a result, as well as the billions and billions we spent as taxpayers that now seems almost criminal in its profligacy. In some states, we're still paying for COVID. As the Victorian budget revealed this week, with the state's COVID debt levy set to rake in $5.5 billion right up to 2027, some 5 years after the pandemic's officially ended. At federal level, Australians deserve to know why the Commonwealth's carefully prepared pandemic plans were junked in panic by Scott Morrison at the start of March 2020. Why there was never any cost-benefit analysis done on any of the lockdowns, why the parliaments were shut, why vaccine mandates were imposed on the states despite the federal government saying that they should not happen. Indeed, here in Victoria, firefighters are still stood down now, even now, for refusing to get a vaccine. Well, that vaccine in particular, one of them, it's been withdrawn because of its health risks, including death by serious blood clots.
These mandates, the mandates that have been enforced, have injured firefighters, and you've got firefighters on work cover now due to vaccine injury. So their plight is very serious, and any continuance of these matters after the 12th is going to have a devastating impact on those who are injured and those who are still stood.
That Victorian firefighter there can't go back to work because he won't have a vaccine and won't have a vaccination, and we've had that vaccine that he's scared about, that he's had medical injuries about, has now been withdrawn from the market. Doesn't make sense. In New South Wales, likewise, police there, those who have refused to be vaccinated can't get back into their old jobs either. Now, to me, Hunt goes too far in his praise to the Morrison government's response in his submission, particularly the National Cabinet process, which turned Morrison from being our national leader, the Prime Minister, into a mere committee chairman. And anyway, the feds could have taken control from the start if they had invoked provisions of the Biosecurity Act. But Hunt is right to demand that in any future pandemic, no unilateral decisions could be made without the transparency, he says, of signed and published, so made public in the media, health advice. Because we must never again respond to a pandemic with measures that do much more harm than the disease itself. Right, let's go to Canberra now. Cam Redden with the headlines.
Good evening. Beijing has accused Australia's Navy of spying on its military exercises prior to a confrontation in the Yellow Sea. A Navy helicopter was enforcing United Nations sanctions in international waters on Saturday when a Chinese jet fired flares in its flight path, forcing the pilot to take evasive action.
This action by China was unprofessional and unacceptable.
Beijing initially claimed the chopper had approached its airspace in a threatening way, now accusing it of conducting close-in reconnaissance, spying, on 3 occasions.
Well, there's no evidence to support the Chinese government's claims.
I stand by what we have said.
Labor has confirmed gas will play a crucial long-term role as part of Australia's energy mix.
There has to be a discussion and an assessment of how all energy sources fit within that journey.
A new strategy confirms new sources of gas supply will be needed to aid the energy transition and remain in the system beyond 2050.
The government seems, after 2 years, to have finally realised what everybody else has been saying.
Labor is now threatening Australian lives and fast-tracking climate collapse.
Tomorrow, the High Court will decide whether another 170 immigration detainees should be released into the community. An Iranian detainee known as ASF-17 is refusing deportation and fighting for his release. If he wins, others in a similar situation could also be let out of detention.
On the legal advice that I've seen, I think the government will win this case.
Opposition leader Peter Dutton giving the strongest indication yet the coalition may back proposed powers the government says will help it deal with non-cooperative detainees.
We'll support tightening of laws. We've put forward some sensible suggestions, so let's see what the court says.
The High Court will deliver its decision at 10 a.m. in Canberra tomorrow.
All right, joining me now to discuss those headlines and more, media writer for The Australian, Sophie Ellsworth, and Deputy Executive Director of the Institute of Public Affairs, Daniel Wild. Well, welcome to you both. Dan, I want to start with this, I have to call it mixed messaging from Labor today. I mean, very clear from Madeleine King. She supports gas. She's the Resources Minister. Frankly, one of the strongest performers they have on the front bench. She says we've got to have gas in order to get to net zero. That's the right call, obviously, but the Greens and the Teals are squealing. And then there's a concern in her language where she says, look, I hope my colleagues in Cabinet share this view. Bottom line is, do you reckon she can get them over the line, Daniel?
So far, the track record isn't good. She is one of the strongest performers in government. From the start, she has been outlining the problems in the energy system. We need to open up our gas reserves and get more gas onto the market. But I think you belled the cat on this earlier in the week when you said the wheels are falling off the government. Well, this is another example. Net zero doesn't work. It doesn't matter whether you have gas or whether you have renewables. It's not a viable long-term policy for the future of Australia. Even Anthony Albanese is now having to concede that his marquee policy of net zero powered by renewables only, renewables everywhere, just simply is not working. And just to give you one example of the broader importance of gas, we calculated that in the eastern region of Victoria alone, there is enough gas there to power every single home in Australia for over 80 years. So the fact that this is locked up by net zero and government regulation is a massive problem.
Yeah, and two things there. You know, they always say we've got a gas shortage. No, we haven't. We've got a supply shortage, plenty of gas in the ground. But I think they're probably mugged by reality. They're doing the books for the budget on Tuesday night, and they realise that their gas exports last year earned Australia $70 billion. If you ban gas, where do you find $70 billion?
Well, that's exactly right. And look, the other point about being mugged by reality is the lights are going to go out. I mean, we've seen what happened in South Australia a number of years ago. We've seen what's happened in Victoria recently, where 500,000 homes were blacked out, and Victoria has gone harder and faster than any other state in its pursuit of net zero. The writing is on the wall for the government, and as I say, even they are having to concede that this is not viable.
PM was in Perth yesterday, bleeding votes. Pollsters are saying they're doing it really tough, particularly in the cost of living sort of seats. We can understand why. He ruled out going to see Nanette Simons. I think that was a missed opportunity. I think it was the wrong call, given how vocal she's been, given how much those pictures so have gone right around the country. And also, there's been some defence or an attempt to defend themselves. This is the West Australian Education Department, who were warned by parents about this so-called teenage jihadi using a Muslim prayer school, a prayer room at a school. Apparently, it's reported he's a convert to Islam, to radicalise other kids. I mean, there's so many areas that the Prime Minister's got these fires that he's not putting out, that he's not dealing with. This is a challenge for him at the moment.
Well, Peter, you're absolutely right with Nanette Simons, where he did not go and see her, and she has been vocal, and good on her for having the courage to stand up after her situation. So you're right, that was a missed opportunity, but perhaps he thought it could have not turned out how he wanted to if he did go and see her and there were cameras there. Secondly, with the teenager, there were concerns raised about him within the school by parents. He assaulted another student. This was not new news to them.
Yeah, but the PM wants to make it about algorithms and social media. That's not right either.
Well, that's not right, but that's a good way, Peter, as you know, to divert the attention. Blame everything on social media. The tech giants, they're under the scrutiny at the moment. Divert the issue and hopefully people will look the other way. But again, a problem that he's not addressing, and I think the public can see through that.
Yeah, he might need to put his ASIO chief and his police chief back in the National Security Cabinet. He might be a bit better informed. Interesting today, the university chiefs come out, this constant news headline about the protests on campuses. I think they're a great shame for all Australians to look at that. But they come out and say, well, we need a ruling. We need a definitive government ruling on the chant, River to the Sea. Now, you've got Dennis Richardson, former ASIO chief, saying it is a violent statement. The chiefs aren't doing anything, they're not acting. And then you've got La Trobe University saying, if you want to walk into a classroom, disrupt a classroom and spew your anti-Semitic venom around, throw it around the class, interrupt the class, have your say, you can do that, we'll support you doing that. Not just protesting out there in the uni square, in the classroom.
Well, it's another example of the complete and total failure of leadership of the Vice-Chancellors. You do not need a ruling on whether the River to the Sea is lawful or not to know that it is wrong and it is immoral and it should not be chanted on your campus. So they're deflecting this off onto the government. They need to take responsibility. They're getting paid $1 million a year, taxpayer dollars, and they need a ruling from the government. I just, get real. The other point I'd make is there's been a litany of failures. We saw the whole business model of universities collapse in COVID. We know that universities are indoctrination factories. They're not educating the next generation of students. And the only positive, I think, to come out of this is more and more Australians are seeing the complete moral vacuum on university campuses.
Yeah, you and I both went to Melbourne Uni, and like a big campus. There might have been a few rat bags around the edges when you went through to get a coffee or a beer or whatever we sort of did in those days. But, I mean, you knew you were privileged to get a university education in those days. It wasn't a right, it was a privilege. I don't know about your parents, but your parents worked hard to help you get there. And you took it seriously, and you did get your classes interrupted by rat bags. That was out of the classroom.
Absolutely, Peter. And the fact that they're saying, if they want to come into the classroom, let them speak for up to 5 minutes. And then, if this continues, contact security. No, this is not okay. You were there. You were paying a lot in HECS fees to get your education. You should not be interrupted. Whoever is interrupting you, on whatever side of the argument, it is not okay, and they need to stop this immediately. I think this is weak, and it shows that universities do not have control of this.
The tax the government was going to put on universities to deal with the housing crisis. They bring all these students in, they make billions of dollars out of foreign students. The argument was, well, you're going to pay a levy on these foreign students to help contribute to the housing costs. The government's gone weak, it's dropped that levy. Do you think the university should have been paying something?
Oh, of course they should be. I mean, the universities are probably one of the most powerful lobby groups in Australia. I'm not surprised the government backed down. Look, I'm not a fan of higher taxes or newer taxes. If you're going to tax anyone, it's the universities. I mean, they are rolling.
I like user pays. This is user pays.
User pays. So whatever we want to call it, they are rolling in it. We know that foreign students, on the eve of COVID, 1 in 3 students in Australia were overseas students. In universities like the University of Sydney, which Mark Scott is the Vice-Chancellor, former ABC activist, it's 50%. Almost 50% of all students are overseas students. And even the government's own report into international students showed that the communities with the highest concentration of students are not benefiting from those students. The benefits go to the universities, the costs are pushed onto the community, and it needs to be fixed.
This one shocked me today. A New Zealand citizen, serial domestic violence abuser, will stay in Australia after the Administrative Appeals Tribunal cancelled plans to deport him. Immigration authorities had tried to cancel his visa. They flagged that they'd send him back to New Zealand. In March 2023, he admitted to attacking his partner with a baseball bat. That followed a stalking conviction in 21, 3 separate DV convictions in 2020, more domestic violence convictions in 2017 and 2015. I mean, honest to God, Sophie, we talk about domestic violence all the time. But this is in the government's bailiwick. They make decisions. This guy now will remain in Australia. I hope to God the government appeals this. But Labor used to call Peter Dutton tough for deporting the bikies and the criminals, particularly those he sent back to New Zealand. This bloke should be gone already.
Peter, that list you read out just kept going and going and going. And I do not think there will be many people watching tonight that would say it is okay that this man is allowed to stay in Australia. And this is where the government could really bring home the point that they are doing something about domestic violence. Here is their moment to seize the opportunity and say this is not okay and this is what we're doing. And they are not grabbing that. And I will say this is one issue that I think the government is quite different to in the approach that I believe Peter Dutton would take. And I don't believe he would allow this to go on, and the coalition would appeal this.
And I don't think the coalition would be delegating that sort of responsibility away from the minister. Just quickly, tomorrow it looks like in UNGA, the UN General Assembly, we're going to get a showdown on the issue of Palestine becoming a full UN member state. A lot of debate inside Labor on this. When it last went to the floor, I think it was under the Gillard government era, Australia abstained. It doesn't look like we're going to support veto action with the United States, but there is some talk, crazy talk, that we could actually vote for it.
Well, we shouldn't be voting for it because Palestine is not a nation state. That's the first hurdle. Now, we can talk about a 2-state solution, but the precursor for that is having peace in the Middle East. You cannot have any progress, if you believe in that, towards Palestine being a state and then having some UN responsibilities when you've got a savage war which is raging that was started on October 7. That's got to be the first priority of government.
If you reward a terrorist state becoming a UN nation state on the basis of the atrocities we all read about on October 7, what does that do to the rule of law around the world?
Well, that's exactly right. And this is one of the key points that we've been saying all along, which is you cannot reward acts of terrorism. You know, Israel has a right to defend itself. It is a wrong move at this point in time to recognise Palestine as a state. You have to have the peace first before you do anything else.
Spot on. Thank you both. Have a good weekend. All right, after break, that scathing assessment by a high-ranking former Treasury official about the PM's Made in Australia policy that's wasting billions and billions of your dollars. Plus gas, Labor hated it, they love it again in Canberra, they still hate it in Victoria. The other states, well, who can tell? Any wonder your power bills are through the roof when we can't even get the policy straight. And a massive High Court decision too on national parks will see non-Indigenous Australians eventually banned from the bush. Well, that's the worry. Welcome back. Still to come, Tony Abbott. He'll join me to discuss the fallout today on pandemic revelations from former Health Minister Greg Hunt. Plus, having just come back from overseas, we'll get the latest on nuclear energy, China, and the negative impact that mass migration is having on our standard of living in Australia. But first, last night I told you how a former senior Treasury official, David Pearl, called out the protectionism of Labor's future Made in Australia policy in his column for The Australian. Mr Pearl took issue with the government's criteria for deciding which businesses receive funding. He says it's about as rigorous as a shape-shifting blancmange. He also wrote the plan should be renamed A Future Made in a Focus Group, and said that during his time in Treasury, it would have been viewed as a blank cheque for policy folly. Well, I'm pleased to say that The bloke that doesn't mince his words, David Pearl, joins me now. David, thank you for your time. I made the point last night, we rarely see former senior public servants, particularly out of central agencies like Treasury, be as frank and as fearless in the media domain as you have been. I know you're often like that behind closed doors, but it was refreshing, I have to say, when I read your column. You refer to this policy as protectionist Ponzi scheme, a protectionist Ponzi scheme. What do you mean by that?
Well, just before I get to that, thank you for having me on, Peter. Unfortunately, public servants aren't as frank behind closed doors as they used to be. And that's one of the reasons that I'm now writing in public. So I'm glad that you read the piece. To your question on the Ponzi scheme, well, we've seen this movie before in Australia, and it is remarkable that Anthony Albanese and Jim Chalmers don't seem to be aware of Australia's history of protectionism. In the post-war era, protection was offered to so-called infant industries. As they received support, their customers in the corporate community suffered cost increases because they were purchasing inputs from inefficient firms. They then knocked on the door of Canberra and wanted their support. So protectionism ended up being protection all round, to the point where the whole economy was effectively a ward of the state. That's what I meant by the Ponzi scheme reference.
So what are your main concerns with this policy? I mean, I do think your point about it being focus group tested is absolutely right. I mean, we're raining money on a whole range of companies. I want to get to the quantum computing one in a moment. But in broad terms, what upsets you the most?
I think the surprising thing, protectionists always existed. Both parties engage in certain protectionism. I think the remarkable thing here is that it's being elevated under the Future Made in Australia banner as the guiding principle of the government's economic policy strategy, supposedly or possibly overwhelming all others. And I think that's the concern. Protectionism, as I wrote in my piece, is a trap. It corrupts our politics. Politicians pick winners. They find it very hard to withdraw support from their champions. We saw that with the car industry over decades. So I think that was my main concern, elevating protectionism under a new label as the central economic policy focus of the government. That's the concern. The end result, like all protectionist folly, is an effective negative supply shock on the economy, lower standards of living. And I want to stress this for a Labor government, lower living standards for low-income people. When you artificially raise the cost structure of an economy, you disproportionately hurt low-income people. And again, that's a real concern of mine. People in the eastern suburbs of Sydney, high-income earners, they can bear those costs. Low-income people, tradies working at the margins can't.
Just on that computing spend, $1 billion to a startup to come to Australia, build something in Brisbane, 400 jobs, about $2.5 million per job. When pushed about this process, it's not a traditional tender process that you and I would be aware of from government. When pushed about the process, we find it was highly secretive. Ministers claim, well, we can't tell you anything, it's all commercial in confidence. Now, this is not how $1 billion has been allocated in the past.
No, I agree. And I go right back to the fundamentals of the policy. You're right, Peter, the process is opaque, and opaqueness tends to be associated with shady dealing, as you know. But if you go right back to the objectives of the policy, we're giving $1 billion to entrepreneurs. That money could go to a hospital, it could go to a school, it could go to improving our infrastructure, improving our housing, dare I say. So again, the process isn't ideal, but even if you had a transparent process, you know as well as I do that public servants are good at drafting documents to ensure that the politically favoured firm or group gets the prize. I go right back to the objectives of the policy and the opportunity cost of all this taxpayer money being pledged to entrepreneurs who can't raise funds from private equity, from hedge funds, people who actually have skin in the game. Again, the buck stops with the taxpayer. That's always been the history with the state development banks in the 70s and the 80s, going right back to the 50s and 60s. It's well-intentioned. It's irresistible. I know focus groups love it, but it ends in tears and it hurts the most vulnerable and the lower income people in the community.
Well, question without notice here, David. I hope you're around next week. I wouldn't mind getting you back on when the budget lands. Put your Treasury brain to good use and come on and give us some analysis if you wouldn't mind doing that. But I urge you, after writing as you did, as powerfully as you did, please keep it up. David Pearl, thank you for your time. All right, let's return to this reversal of sorts from Labor when it comes to gas. And I say of sorts because I'm not convinced that her colleagues are going to back Credlin, the Resources Minister, as they should. Let's bring in the Australian's Environment Editor, Graham Lloyd. I'll get to the politics in a moment, Graham, but please, in broad terms, what's this announcement today all about?
Well, good evening, Peter. In broad terms, this is an announcement that says Labor agrees with all those sensible things that we've been talking about to increase supply of gas, to back up renewables if you're going to build them, to make it available for industry so we can have a competitive manufacturing sector, and to keep selling gas to all our foreign customers to play our part in the global decarbonisation and also underpin the budget. So in a sense, this is a suite of reforms that, if put in place, you'd have to say would be very good.
Well, that's good to know. We haven't been wasting our time, you know, Graham. I'm a bit sceptical. King says, I hope the policy is shared by my cabinet colleagues. I want to hope they will come with her on this. What do you think?
Well, I think there's tough politics here, Peter. It's, very likely that a good number of her colleagues will not support her. We've seen backbenchers come out today and try and distance themselves from it because they're concerned about their seats, and the Teals and the Greens have all come out in opposition. And I've got to say, all through today, I've been deluged with emails from all the peak environment groups and climate groups, and they are all declaring war on this new gas policy. They don't like it. They're going to fight against it. So Credlin is going to need some real support from Anthony Albanese and others to hold the nerve if she wants to get this through.
And just quickly, I mean, it's completely at odds with Labor in Victoria, who wants to basically ban the barbecue, ban the gas cooktop, can't use it for heating, but it's now all systems go in Canberra. It doesn't make sense.
No, that's right. I think one of the refreshing things was the commitment to freedom of choice by families, how they want to heat and run their households. Credlin made it clear that she supports the use of gas as an option there, which is something that will come as a great surprise to Victoria.
Talk to me about this significant High Court judgment that's ruled that Australia's National Parks Authority can be criminally prosecuted for damaging sacred sites in the NT. What concerns me here is we've already, Graham, got a whole lot of bureaucrats who run our national parks closing the gates now, worried about Mount Arapiles and rock climbers and damage to sacred sites, not just sacred sites, but just the fact that the park has Indigenous history in it, shutting down our access if we're not Indigenous Australians. Won't this make the National Park bureaucrats even more reluctant to keep the parks open as they are now?
Well, I think it's going to concentrate the mind of anybody who has to now take authority and responsibility. We're seeing a transfer of management and responsibility of national parks over to Indigenous groups. We're seeing a lot of lawfare in the area to try and prosecute issues of land management. I think this is a very fraught area for any bureaucrat to make a decision, and if it's backed up with potential criminal charges if they get it wrong, I think they're going to be very wary.
I think it'll tie their hands. Graham Lloyd, thank you. All right, quick break. After the break, Tony Abbott is going to open up about the pandemic, the premiers, all the stuff out there today, plus why he thinks the Prime Minister needs to pick up the phone and call Xi Jinping before it's too late and we lose one of our military personnel in these Chinese acts of aggression. Welcome back. Well, it'd be no surprise, but the more distance we get from the COVID pandemic, the more absurd and crazy and unfathomable all those rules now seem. At the time, the medical evidence was arbitrary, I'd regard at best, but now this has also been backed up today by the former Federal Health Minister, Greg Hunt, who's gone public. making it very clear that some of it was highly political. Well, no surprises there. Joining me is someone who consistently called out the overreach, former Prime Minister Tony Abbott. Well, Tony, thank you for your time. I mean, it's almost like I have PTSD when I go back into those horrible couple of years coming out of Victoria, particularly coming out of Melbourne, how tough that all was. But we finally got some truth today from one of the key COVID players, the former Federal Health Minister, Greg Hunt, who's gone public, confirming that most of the big decisions, they weren't just about health advice, they were highly political. In fact, he really goes after the premiers in particular. But I suspect you're not surprised by any of this, are you?
No, Peter, and I think you put it pretty well in your editorial earlier when you said that the problem was that the policy to deal with COVID turned out to be far worse than the disease itself. And when you go back and look at this honestly and dispassionately, you'd have to say that the first mistake that governments made was throwing out the carefully prepared pandemic plans that we all had in panic in early March 2020 because of the dire photographs coming out of overwhelmed Italian hospitals. But I think that had a lot more to do with the Italian hospital system than it did with the severity of the disease itself.
We've still got all the COVID debt. In Victoria, we're still paying COVID levies. In fact, we're paying COVID levies $5.5 billion worth until 2027. We've got firefighters and nurses and police still stood down over vaccine mandates because they won't have AstraZeneca in particular, and AstraZeneca has now been withdrawn from the market. I mean, this is still crazy that we're talking about this now in mid-2024.
Exactly right, Peter. And my fear is that without a fair income Royal Commission type inquiry into the whole response to COVID, next time a pandemic happens, and it will, we'll take the over-the-top response to this one as the model for all future actions. But the last thing we want to be is locked up for several years, again, in response to a disease that turned out to be relatively mild.
That's because none of the politicians, Tony Abbott, want us to know what they were told and what they decided in the papers that they read behind closed doors. That is what this is about. It's not about the next pandemic so that we are as best prepared as we can be. This is about basic backside covering from politicians like Daniel Andrews and Anastasia Palaszczuk. And I have to say, frankly, too, Scott Morrison, Josh Frydenberg and the others.
Look, I'm confident that inside the coalition, a lot of these issues would have been more debated than they seemed on the surface. But there's no doubt that for a period of time, we ceased being a democracy and became a kind of a doctocracy. Now, I'm all in favour of taking expert advice seriously, but in the end, we've got to remain an open, transparent, accountable democracy, and I'm afraid we weren't for a couple of years during the pandemic.
When we lost those Australians in MH17, you picked up the phone and you know, I was there and I saw how dogged you were with Vladimir Putin. Now, we haven't lost an Australian military life, I say yet. This has now been 3 incidents involving the Chinese, 3 very dangerous incidents. I hope we don't lose an Australian military life, but that could be more, you know, good luck rather than good management to date. We find out, though, that the Prime Minister has not rung his counterpart. The Minister hasn't spoken to the Minister for Defence. The Foreign Minister hasn't spoken to the Foreign Minister. It's all been done right down the batting order by bureaucrats to register Australia's disgust at what's happened yet again. What would you do differently?
Well, the problem here, Peter, is that this isn't the first time it's happened. This is now the 3rd time that Australian military personnel have been endangered by the actions of Chinese ships and planes, and we have undoubtedly been acting within our perfect rights in international waters and in international airspace. So these are not the actions of a friend. And what puzzles me is why the government is so keen to roll out the red carpet for the Chinese Premier next month, given that this is how China is currently treating us.
I know you've just come back from Europe. You and I have spoken, and we talked particularly about those UK elections over the weekend and this real division now with these pro-Palestinian, pro-Gaza, pro-Hamas candidates getting up at local council level. It's a bad portent for us here in Australia as well. And obviously that concern that Europe really has about Russia being on the march. They seem more alive to the threats of these times. You know, the sense that it is like the end of the 1930s and we are perhaps here in Australia. Is that a fair comment?
Look, I think it is, Peter. I think that what so many of the democracies engaged in after the fall of the Berlin Wall and this assumption that market capitalism had triumphed in all places for all times, we engaged in a kind of a military, industrial and even cultural disarmament. And what we need to do now is to recover our military and our industrial strength, but above all else, our cultural self-confidence as free, independent, Western democracies with a strong Judeo-Christian tradition.
If you were still PM, Tony Abbott, would you have 3 flags behind you or one when you talk about, you know, national identity?
Look, I'm more than happy with the one flag that unites all of us. I certainly don't think that the flag of some of us should fly co-equally with the flag of all of us, just as I don't think that we need to be welcome to our own country at every civic occasion. One of the other things that would be different, we wouldn't have these pro-Hamas tent encampments on our campuses. I just think there's been a failure of will and a failure of self-confidence by too many people who should know better.
Good on you, Tony Abbott. I think many of us wish you were still there. Thank you for your time. Right after the break, a 10-year-old, yes, a 10-year-old has been accused of serious sexual assault in Cairns. We'll get into that after the break. Plus, world-beating cancer researchers had their budgets cut in Victoria. This is huge. This is what happens when a state becomes an economic basket case. All right, let's bring it home with my panel. Pauline Hanson's Chief of Staff, James Ashby, and columnist with The Spectator, Terry Barnes. Welcome to you both. I want to start with the youth crime crisis yet again. Horrific reports today. A 10-year-old boy, 10 years old, accused of an alleged sexual assault involving an adult woman, a tourist in Cairns. We know it's a big problem in Queensland, and we know it's in Victoria as well, but the stats in Queensland, you've got this shocking statistic. Just under 10,000 times young people have breached bail in that state. And the number of child recidivists, so multiple crimes being committed by these young people, that's what a recidivist is, that has now doubled. James, very disturbing figures, but when a 10-year-old's involved in sexual assault, I don't think it gets any worse than that.
No, it starts to become very concerning. It's really a pox on this Labor government here in Queensland. But, you know, one of the first pieces of legislation this Premier the Labor government in Queensland moved back in 2015 was to remove the ability for a lot of these courts to detain these young kids. We're talking about serious offenders here. Now, this isn't just a Queensland issue, as you rightfully point out. It is right across the country. And I think, given the serious nature of what's occurred just today and reported on, obviously, we need to look broader at this problem, and perhaps I'm going to make a recommendation to Pauline Hanson tomorrow that we deeply consider an inquiry on a national front here through the Senate, because this is a real problem. Look, federally, we pay out a huge amount of money through family tax benefits A and B, and if it's okay for federal politicians, both the Coalition and Labor have backed withholding money, particularly through Family Tax Benefit A, for those parents who don't immunise their children. Perhaps it's time we have a deep, serious conversation about withholding money from families who have repeat offending children. Not first-time offenders, but repeat offenders, because clearly the $400 we're paying, well, up to $400 a fortnight for some of these families and each child that they have is not working. Their parenting skills are just missing, and maybe an inquiry is what this country needs.
Wow. Well, I think a few of my listeners would find that very interesting. Terry, we talked about the Victorian budget earlier in the week. It was handed down, of course, on Tuesday. One of the things, there's not many things Victoria still does well, but medical research, it really is a national, if not international, leader. There's a comprehensive cancer centre in Victoria. It's the old Peter Mac, but it's got lots of other elements in it as well. It has suffered a 75% funding cut. Now, that is extraordinary. It's massive. The Treasurer said, oh, look, it's not been a reduction in base funding. It's not as big as that. But the professor in charge of it said, yes, it is. He's the one that has put the data out there and said we knew something was coming. We were told it was a tough budget, but nothing as bad as this. You know this area very well. We also know that cancer rates are climbing in this country. What do you make of this announcement?
Well, certainly the Victorian Comprehensive Cancer Centre has been an institution in Victoria that was invented or created under the Baillieu-Napthine government a decade or more ago, and has bipartisan support, and always has. But when you see this type of funding cut in the Victorian budget, as a result of the Victorian balance sheet going so deep in red ink that it's not funny. I mean, we're talking about next to $250 billion worth of debt on the books, almost $200 million now, and it'll get bigger. Things are going to have to give. Worthy causes like the Comprehensive Cancer Centre are going to, they're being hit. They're being hit because of this government's, this Andrews-Allen government's absolute and total financial incompetence. It's an absolute disgrace, Peter, absolute disgrace.
James, why is Labor spending $40 million to advertise these tax cuts that everyone's going to get anyway? We don't have to apply for them. We all know about them. Why waste $40 million in ads, which are basically promoting the Labor Party?
Yeah, well, that's exactly what it is. It's a cheap way of getting free publicity for the Labor Party and trying to convince the Australian voters that they're actually doing something. They're not. Look, I would much rather see that $40 million repurposed here in Queensland. We've got a Bruce Highway that is a goat track at the moment. The Prime Minister flew in here for Beef Week this week and didn't actually get to see how bad a condition our beef roads, our Bruce Highway is in. And we've got a hospice here in Rockhampton that is in desperate need of a few extra $1 million to put additional beds on so that people in their final weeks of life actually have the care and need provided to them in places outside the southeast corner. So $40 million could be much better spent. I'm happy to take the bulk share of that for Queensland. I'm sure there'll be some left over for the other states. But no, this is just wasted money. It shouldn't be put into advertising.
Yeah, no, I think it's shocking. Terry, another thing that shocked me today too, another bloke yet again on the NDIS. This one's a sex offender, a convicted sex offender. He was back in front of the courts because the allegation is he's breached a supervision order. But in the case of the discussion with the magistrate, I think it was, or certainly the junior judge, $500,000, $500,000 is his NDIS package. And they asked him what was his disability, and it was obesity and I think some mental health issues.
Well, that's right. And he was in hospital and he got a bit of slap and tickle in hospital from another NDIS recipient on her package. Apparently they lit cigarettes afterwards, which gave the magistrate and the lawyers in the courtroom a bit of a laugh. But it's not funny, Peter. It's simply not funny. I mean, this is the sort of boondoggly disgrace that I think the Minister for the NDIS, Bill Shorten, actually has to front up to the taxpayers of Australia and say, look, explain. I'm going to tell you that this is wrong. But he's not going to, is he? He's not going to. He's going to say, oh, we're going to do something about the NDIS, but it's going to be on the never, never. But incidents like this just show what problems there are in the National Disability Insurance Scheme. They need to be dealt with.
Spot on. I will be looking at that closely next week in the budget, as I'm sure you are, Terry Barnes. James, good luck for budget week. I know it's a huge week, long hours for staff, you included. Obviously, working for a crossbencher, you don't have the resources of the big guys, but all the best for budget week. Of course, don't miss it here on Sky News. Have a good weekend, everyone. I'll see you Monday. Here's Andrew.